Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Chow, and I'm joined by my big-brained co-hosts, Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Yo.
Hi.
Hi. Today we are starting our series on Transhumanist Sci-Fi with Galapagos by Kurt Vonnegut. I'm very excited about this series. Since this is a review of Galapagos, we won't reveal any spoilers. If you haven't read the book yet, keep on listening. If you want to join our discussion, you can find our book club on Reddit by clicking on the link in the episode description. And if you would like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link, which is also in our episode description. At our bookshop store page, you can find the books for our book club and other books that we recommend. And we are also on social media at Canonical Pod. Next week, we'll be having an in-depth discussion of this book, Galapagos. We hope you'll join us for that episode as well.
So, James, you're really excited about this series. What's so exciting to you about transhumanism?
Well, I like sci-fi in general, transhumanist or no, so I'm excited about that. I'm excited about Kurt Vonnegut because I generally like Kurt Vonnegut, and I haven't read him in years. I thought I had read Galapagos, but apparently I haven't because it felt totally new to me, so that's exciting. Transhumanist sci-fi is not more exciting than other subgenres of sci-fi, but I like sci-fi generally, so I am looking forward to transhumanist sci-fi.
While we were setting up for this series, we were discussing what we should call it and what we should focus on, post-humanism or transhumanism. So what's the difference between the two?
I think for a lot of people, when they use those words, there isn't a difference. So if you're looking online, people use them interchangeably. There is a difference, but it's kind of technical. To me, I think the difference is that transhumanism is about human beings being really enthusiastic about changing their bodies and changing their human lifestyles to live longer lives or different lives. From my understanding, post-humanism is more about understanding whether or not there is such a thing as human nature and whether or not human beings really should be thought of as kind of the center of the universe. And, like if we have certain things that we grant to human beings because they're human beings, I think post-humanism would question why shouldn't we also give those privileges or responsibilities to other animals. So there is some overlap there, but I think there's a difference as well.
So we are calling this series transhumanist, but it very well could be more post-humanist. We're just going with transhumanist.
Yeah, I think it's up for debate whether any of these books fall on one side or the other, or maybe there's a chance that they're right on the middle on the fence.
So yeah, then in your opinion, is Galapagos more transhumanist or post-humanist?
In my opinion, Galapagos is definitely more of a post-humanist novel, just because there is a lot of talk about human beings and their nature and human beings changing, but it's not an enthusiastic change. It's talking about how human beings might be worse off the way they are now and how changes might make them better. But those changes are not being made because human beings want them to change. The novel follows a group of people who are supposed to be taking what's called the nature cruise of the century from Ecuador to the Galapagos Islands. And through a series of mishaps, they end up being stranded on the island. And when they're on the island, they eventually change. Their bodies change over 1 million years, and eventually they become a new sort of creature. I think it's questionable whether the new creature is still a human being, but they become furry. They start to have flippers. They have small brains and snouts, and they just swim around under the water catching fish. And I think in this novel, Vonnegut is trying to say that those people might end up being happier. Their lives are definitely simpler, but maybe happier than the lives that we have nowadays.
And you're not spoiling the book for anyone here yet, right? Because this is something that's given to us fairly early on.
Yeah, so this novel, I don't think it's possible to have a spoiler in this novel because everything that happens is told from the beginning of the novel.
So what did you think about this novel?
I think this novel is really wonderful. Like James was saying earlier, I haven't read Vonnegut in a long time. I also thought that I had read all of his stuff, but I did not read this one. The inventive narration is really the thing that I love the most about this novel. It reminds me of in Slaughterhouse-Five, there's a character, Billy Pilgrim. He becomes unstuck in time and he moves back and forth in time. In this novel, we have a similar sort of thing going on where the narration shows you how important everything that's happening is because the person doing the narrating is actually speaking from a million years in the future. So he knows what happens and he knows how important all of the things that are happening are. Vonnegut, I think he really gets a lot of mileage out of the trip that these people are taking to the Galapagos Island. The boat they're on is called the Bahia de Darwin. And in the novel, this boat is compared to Noah's Ark and also Charles Darwin's ship, the HMS Beagle. There are 3 different kind of strands in this novel, and they all kind of braid together perfectly. Each of the 3 boat trips kind of reinforces the other one and adds interest to the others. We were talking in previous episodes about philosophical novels as well. I think that this could be thought of as a philosophical novel because it's so full of ideas, but it's not complicated and it's also interestingly full of judgment. Like Vonnegut's opinion is never hidden. He's not shy about sharing it, but it's not preachy. I think the thing that most people love about Vonnegut is that you can tell that he really loves humanity, but at the same time, he also really hates us. And the tension between that is really interesting and what makes his work so meaningful.
Yeah, I agree. Like the two of you, I haven't read Vonnegut in years, and I don't think I'm close to reading all of his works, much closer to maybe half. But this was a great reintroduction. I didn't know much about it, and it reminded me a lot in some ways of the first book I ever read of his, which is still maybe my favorite, Cat's Cradle. But even though there are similarities, this is a much lighter book overall. Not that that makes it better or worse, but just really enjoyable. Some of the darkest ideas that he uses are given us with this levity that you kind of forget how violent his topics are, such as like when he's talking about these missiles being shot. He's talking about them making love to the radar dishes that they're programmed to seek out. And I loved that image.
Everything is made complicated in this novel. Things that are detestable, he presents it in a lovely way. Things that are lovely, he presents it in kind of a strange, almost alienating way. He does that all the time. It's very playful and surprising. So from sentence to sentence or paragraph to paragraph, you're kind of pulled back and forth. You feel love of humanity and nature, but you also feel kind of disgust for both, which is what you talked about, Yed. And that's very engaging for me. You're always kind of on your toes.
Yeah, I think that has to do with the narrator. The narrator doesn't dwell on anything for too long. Like, the description is very vivid at times, but it doesn't stick around too long for anything to wear out its welcome.
I really love how visual the text is. I'm assuming you guys have read Breakfast of Champions by Vonnegut. That book is full of little drawings that he made to illustrate certain things in the text, and they're usually very, very simple, but cute. And here, there aren't drawings, but anytime someone is going to die soon, there is an asterisk next to their names. And our narrator, Leon, explains what that means in the beginning. And those asterisks come and go and has a really interesting effect on the reader, certainly on me.
I'd like to talk about Leon a little bit. I think he's very interesting to me because at the start you think, okay, he's just like a stand-in for Vonnegut, the way in The Human Stain, the way Zuckerman is a stand-in for Roth. But by the end of the book, and I won't spoil it for you, I guess, he becomes a full character, much fuller than I expected. So that was great. I really like that aspect of it. And I think part of what I like about the voice, what I mentioned before, is that he's got a very jaded voice. He's seen everything and he portrays everything from this point of view of how stupid human beings are, but he can't leave them behind. He's addicted to viewing stupidity because he's addicted to loving humanity.
I think that's what makes the novel so emotionally affecting for me, is that it's a very sincere kind of love that the narrator and Vonnegut, I presume, have for humanity, wherein you're willing to look at all of the faults and you're looking very carefully at the worst of humanity, but you refuse to look away. And you refuse to look away because you're invested, because it's important to you how these things turn out. Even if they turn out in the wrong way or the way that you don't like, you have to pay attention.
I think we are also invested because he portrays characters that are very compelling and real, and he doesn't shy away from the complications of real life. For example, Mary's husband dying of cancer, and he doesn't shy away from using or portraying very basic but fundamental emotions like love or hate or jealousy. I know that this is probably a bias of mine, but I want that from a book. I want writers who are not afraid of doing that, and I want characters who do that. It's a criticism I used recently about The Moviegoer, but also in other books where I felt like the writer just doesn't really show the character and humanity in its fullness. And that's what I see here, and it's what I really enjoy about this book. And I think the fact that he manages to do this, but also introduce big pressing issues about humanity, is what makes that second part of it effective. The ideas are effective for me because he pairs it with what feels like a very real portrayal of humanity and of people.
Yeah, in this book, if the characters didn't feel real in the way that you're describing, I think the book would have been kind of pointless, because we're really meant to see ourselves in these characters. If we don't read these characters as real people, then the emotional connection, the intended emotional response, I think won't work. I think that it's really important. It's not kind of like a metafictional exercise. These are real people, and I want you to see them as such. So we've said a lot of nice things about this novel. I think it's clear that all three of us really liked it, but is there anything that you didn't like about this novel?
Leon was a curiosity for me at first, and then he started to bug me when I wasn't sure what he was doing there. But by the end of the novel, I was won over, and I enjoyed his role in the narration. So I don't think it was actually a problem for me. I don't know. I don't think I have any real issues.
I talked earlier about how these characters feel really real to me, but at the same time, I think you could say that some of the characters in this novel are cartoonishly exaggerated.
Such as?
For me, I think it's the Von Kleist brothers who are exaggerated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so those two characters, but specifically the captain, I guess. He's much more of a caricature than the other characters.
He isn't as realistic as Mary or Akiko or the other more sympathetic characters, but I think that there is something in the core of his character that rings true. Even if it's kind of exaggerated, it's not an exaggeration of something unreal. So I can still kind of accept him as a character. I think he does add a lot of comedic effect to the novel. He's there to prevent the novel from being too dark, because there is some dark subject matter, like Sam mentioned, but it never feels dark. It always feels pretty light and easy to read.
Well, he's a good example of people failing up, and we have quite a bit of that, and maybe they're not exaggerated the way he is, but even with that exaggeration, I feel like he's a good stand-in for those kinds of characters and how they would fail in such situations if suddenly they were called on to lead for real.
I think he represents a social problem of humanity rather than a personal problem. He represents the capacity for people born into privilege to avoid the repercussions of their incompetence. But we'll talk more probably next week about him. For me, the thing that really stood out as the one negative thing is the pacing of the second half of the novel. I found that in the beginning of the novel, there were lots of new ideas and lots of exciting things being introduced. But then maybe in the last third of the novel, I felt like we were more or less just tying up loose ends. And I felt that there was a little bit of slack in the last third of the novel where some of the loose ends could have been tied up a little bit quicker than they were. Because of the way the novel is structured, we know about all of the events that happen at the end from the beginning. And what happens in the end of the novel is more or less just filling out the details of exactly how things happened. And since we kind of anticipate, we know what's going to come, we're just saying, okay, well, let's get to the next thing because that's what we want. And there's a little bit of slack where it doesn't seem as important in between these major plot points that we already know about.
Well, I didn't really feel this way. I thought the pacing always was kept very brisk. The chapters are short, and he presents a lot of vignettes and asides so that that kind of rhythm is maintained throughout the book. I didn't really feel like it slowed down much at the end.
Here's something that we have talked about as being a problem in other books, but I wonder if it's a problem for either of you in this book. So one of our favorite topics of derision in the past has been coincidence, and many coincidences happening in a single book. And coincidence is a pretty big thing in this one, but I think it's used to a much different effect from the other books we've read so far this year. Partly because it was humorous for Vonnegut to have so many coincidences happening at once. But I think there are also thematic reasons. Do you feel the same way? Do you see it as different here?
I didn't mind the coincidences because Vonnegut leans into it. It's kind of the point that there are so many coincidences because we have this particular narrator who is talking about events from so far into the future. And because he's omniscient, he knows all and he's willing to tell everything because he's got a particular point. He wants to show us how everything is connected. It's not like Station 11, which is the novel that I love to pick on, because in that novel, the coincidences were not the point. And because they weren't the point, they just seemed really obvious. They just stood out. Whereas in this novel, they stand out because Vonnegut wants you to notice them.
I saw a big parallel between coincidence and entropy. How this is a book about evolution and about change. And a lot of the reasons why life exists on Earth is due to coincidence.
So I've got two broad comments on this. First, it's not a problem for me in this book because speaking from a craft point of view, a coincidence is only an issue in plotting when you're trying to get the reader to think about what's going to happen next. And when that's resolved unsatisfyingly due to coincidence, that's a problem. Because when you have the question, what's going to happen next, and it's solved almost too easily, that's what people say when they say a coincidence is a problem in plot. So that's not the issue here because that's not what drives the novel. The novel isn't driven by what's going to happen next. It's driven by how did this all happen and why did this all happen? So because of that, the coincidence doesn't matter. The reader isn't waiting to see what's going to happen next because the reader already knows. And the second reason why I think it's not an issue is because you have a retrospective narrator who's looking back a million years at what happened. Anything that happened a million years ago will, of course, lead to what happens in the future. So it makes sense because he's picking out the key events that occur that led to what occurred, in the future or his present. Does that make sense? Like those events that he picks out will, of course, be coincidences because that's what he picks out.
Yeah, that's what I meant by his broad perspective. Like, he can see everything, so of course he's going to tell the story this way.
Yeah. So it's kind of an interesting way to look at evolution, right? You could say, well, what a coincidence that this reptile happened to crawl on land, right? At that moment when he could survive. And then, boom, millions of years later, we have land dwellers. It is a coincidence, but it's also what happened. So you pick out that key event. So that's, for me, what's very clever about the way it's constructed is, yes, it is a coincidence, but it's also what had to happen in order for the future to occur. Okay, let's have a short pause here. And when we come back, we'll talk about who we would recommend this book to. Welcome back. So, who are you giving this book to?
I mean, I think anybody would like this book. I think there's a reason why Vonnegut is one of the most beloved American authors of the 20th century.
I agree. I think it poses a lot of interesting and good, important questions, but it does so lightly and with a lot of fun. And it's not a difficult read either. So it's appropriate for just about any age or comprehension level.
I have a question for you guys. Both of you have relatives who are white.
Go on.
Do your relatives read Vonnegut? My relatives don't because, they don't read English novels. We all assume everyone would like this book, but how many of your relatives do you think have read Vonnegut and appreciate Vonnegut? I don't know. I'm legitimately curious because I don't have access to that kind of information. I don't know people who grew up with Vonnegut who are older than me.
I think a lot of my family has. I don't know what they've read. I would be surprised if most of them haven't read Slaughterhouse-Five. I don't think any of them have read this book from the people I surveyed, but neither had any of us.
I think that nobody in my family would have read this book, but people would have read Vonnegut in general. People our age probably would have read some Vonnegut in high school or in college. He's not an obscure writer by any definition. I think that, he's not the kind of writer that you have to go out searching for. He's on the top of most lists. So there are people who are not necessarily book people who know about him, and then there are also book people who know about him and perhaps love him even more deeply because they're so entrenched in the book world.
Actually, I take it back. I know for a fact that my dad read some Vonnegut because the copy of Breakfast of Champions that I used was his.
Well, the reason why I ask this question, besides what I stated before, is this book only received, like 3.9 stars on Goodreads. All of us love this book. And Vonnegut is kind of ubiquitous. If you grew up at a certain age, you probably read Vonnegut at school, like you said, Yed. But I wonder, if that translates to enjoying or loving the book. Because if I make a recommendation, I probably will make it on the assumption that they will really like the book. I'm wondering if he's the kind of writer where maybe we really like the book, but we're his target demographic. We're big brains. Do you think, even though people have heard of Vonnegut, maybe they don't like him as much?
I think it's possible, but I also don't think he's a big brain writer. I mean, there are big ideas here, but I don't think it requires a big brain to understand or appreciate or enjoy.
Well, the thing about Vonnegut is he's a known quantity. It's like if you know somebody who's into music and you'd be like, man, I just heard of this great band. They're called the Beatles. All of their songs are great. Like, people don't talk about the Beatles because we assume that everyone knows and loves them. I think it's the same with Vonnegut. I think that most people have some familiarity with him, and I think most people have some affection for him to varying degrees. But because he's so common and so well known, you don't really need to mention his work so much.
Well, let's conclude here then. Thank you for listening. Did you also love Galapagos as much as we did? Or did you think we were way off base here? We'd love for you to let us know on Reddit. You can find that link below. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod, and if you would like to support us in your local bookstore, you can use, once again, our bookshop.org link, which is also in our episode description. Next week, we'll be back with an in-depth discussion of Galapagos. If you're interested, please go ahead and find a copy of this book. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.